Hi, my name is Blue X Baxter. Throughout the distribution or recording, rather, of this video, uh, I'm going to be wearing earplugs due to the possibility of the evil that which is both present and surrounding me, known as the Antichrist, in accordance with Islamic custom or messianic provision. I am going to be recording this before I eat. In the Germanic, this is related the do what you have to do, then do what you want to do concept. Perhaps oversimplified. Throughout this, I'm going to be referencing in characteristic a kind of logic. These are two cigarette, your Laertes. You kind of don't want to disturb them. It's hard to know or to find some sort of ambience or acquiescence between the video and myself. See if we can do it this way. You can see the ends. And in metallic, sorry I showed my face. These things here. I did not wish to show my face. I have shown my face. I wish to talk about basically a premise which exists in American or American constitutionality, such that to avail to you a kind of status or knowledge of things which have preceded yourself regarding a premise or precedent. Looking at a screensaver, I'm very sorry. A premise or precedent which has affected essentially your law, and as such of that, your governance, your government, your being. And this is something that I wish to avail to you. The unspoken nature regards a kind of classification of symbolism. And in one sense, a symbolism can be taken as a point of art, and a symbolism can be taken as a point of military or militarism. Significant happenings in the past have included the Trojan horse, the falling of the statue of Saddam, the atom bomb, the atom bombs, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Again, I'm speaking with earplugs, so please bear with me as pertinence to the volume regarding the surrounding environment. Once upon a time, there was a civil war in the United States. There were two sides. Before the Civil War was the War of 1812. Before the War of 1812, there was the War of the Revolution. It regards a kind of religious costume which, in accordance with essentially the set of what I am doing currently, means that this sort of thing is kind of an unspoken and unknown, I wouldn't say treasure, but rather a faculty, a facility, a way of relating and I guess otherwise transcending or negating a kind of history or a kind of past to which we are all present, which then again, in the same sense, affects our future. There was once upon a time a revolution, and the revolution produced or was related a kind of merit and condition. And this is, in effect, the total of the regularity of that which is known as the Constitution of the United States of America. If we fast forward a few years, we had a series of explanations which could not find ends meet. When the words ran out, the war was produced. Immediately preceding the war, there was an agreement. The agreement of communism, which was a synecdoche related the spectrum which exists in a kind of consciousness. There's a kind of dark, which is the self, and a kind of light, which is the self-related God. And related to this, the Communist Manifesto preceded actually the Civil War, and there was an arrangement that was agreed upon regarding kind of a civil society or an inherent non-impotence resulting in a kind of actualization. From many sides, this was ratified. But despite our best efforts in the degrees of politics and discussion, there arose a war. And that war is known as the Civil War of America, which occurred in the United States of America. Take the premise then of this, that we have a spectrum, we have a dark spectrum, a light spectrum, kind of a finalization is what we will say of the prophecy related to terms of Israel, a kind of messianic gesture, a kind of finality of the sort of extent of the Jewish religion, the propagation, the certainty, the facilitation of the kind of unknown aspect of God, and then how it would then affect the self-awareness or the known portion of the self, and how those things are, and then how those things correlate to a kind of being or a kind of life or a kind of daily life or a kind of synergy, synecdoche, um, error, or otherwise behavior associated the daily life of what would then be called something that is a citizen, as opposed to a slave, as opposed to a tyrant, as opposed to a king, as opposed to a politic, as opposed to a theocratic, as opposed to a conscious objector, as opposed to a learner or a student, or something of that initiate or being of that caliber. There was once upon a time a civil war that did which occur in the United States, preceding of which there was a communist manifesto or an agreement, and then subsequently about and of that agreement there was which a war which was fought, which the agreement occurred in Washington State, and the subsequent war occurred nationally. In many ways, even presently, the Washington State is left kind of and somewhat in the dark, being very far from Washington, D.C. It kind of independently of the capital of the nation developed a kind of center or moral center thereof and about itself, which this day influences kind of a daily activity or a behavior. There was a war which was fought for all points and circumstances and things which I am going to avail to you. There was an end of that war. The beginning of the end of that war occurred in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, at which point one General Lee threw up his hands and said that all things which are related to this is all my fault. What you do not know before that is that a descendant, actually, of General Lee had raped a slave girl. And it was done in a very violent and horrific fashion. And at which point the Confederacy turned over this person to the Union and had him march upon the Union and in this sort of drastic confess what it is that this person had done. It was actually the grandson of General Lee. After which there was kind of a point of Gettysburg, the center, more or less, of Washington, D.C. regards Pittsburgh. And the reason that it regards Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is because in Pennsylvania, the Constitution was signed once upon a time. What people do not know about the Constitution being signed is that it includes two parts. One part regards a kind of British tradition, which was characteristic forefront of the Revolution, where kind of in a psychic or witchcraft or any sort of that manner, religious, a girl, a child says, "I like it when daddy rapes me." At which point there was a Jewish man who actually went through with that and killed that person, that is Virginia Dare. And kind of in a shadow sense or a repentance or an acquiescence to what was just done. There was have you ever heard of Skull and Bones? Um, the idea or meaning behind which is that basically you find a male who is kind of effeminate, and from the male you take a testicle, and this kind of provides a hegemony or connection to the between lines of the dark spectrum and the light sort of spectrum, which invariably are the exact same thing because it is the self that is perceiving it, that then kind of coalesces to a sort of event or advent. Well, once upon a time there was a king, and the king, kind of in reference to the Crusades, literally actually raped a woman who was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. And this occurred in America, and it produced a person, and this person was subject to exactly what was just stated, and thus begins the trans epic or transsexual epic of more or less becoming a woman from being a man. And this involves essentially all kinds of religious or religious otherwise sort of choreography or clergy logic or that sort of thing. If we go now forward to the Civil War, General Lee's best friend was his wife. His wife was the person who was originally subject, once upon a time, to the kind of Masonic, not satanic, tradition of the kind of essentially rape which associates itself with the removal of this testicle. The transition from the male to being a female, the idea of being a submissive, choreographed, write it in black or I'll kill you kind of traditionalism, which, anyway, the person to which we're talking who was present at the signing of the Constitution kind of as a backdraft or a shadow or a catch-all, that kind of sort of thing. Was General Lee's wife. General Lee's wife was more or less captured by the Union during the Civil War and was made kind of a maidservant to an Abraham Lincoln. And this is kind of where our narrative, rather than our war, sort of arises. There was a Gettysburg, certainly, and the Gettysburg was fought by a General Lee. General Lee actually ended up pushing rather than to Pittsburgh, to the original citing and signing of the Constitution, and meeting then a George Washington. They then kind of came to an agreement, but at the same time, as you might have heard, that there was a collateral or a corollary rather that kind of continued the fighting, that for many weeks people did not know that the war had ended and they kept fighting. It ended up actually in Washington State, And there is a site or a placing there, actually in Olympia, and it's known as Antietam. And there was once upon a time a giant meteor which kind of landed itself at the coast and ripped its way the whole way through, sort of thing, such that the ocean becomes the sea. And there was a division there, present actually in Olympia, and on one side was the South, and on one side was the North. And at the same time that General Lee was kind of discussing things over with Washington, there was a Jefferson, a President Jefferson from the South, and he was actually at a different site, not too very far away, but as it turned out, his father actually kind of displaced or ratted out his position to Abraham Lincoln at the same time that General Lee was discussing the end of the war with Washington. Abraham Lincoln's father was Washington. And so Abraham Lincoln went to that spot, and where the Bic lighter comes from is the same place that the Zippo lighter comes from. They found President Jefferson from the South in a kind of tent at a certain spot, and doused him with fuel, gasoline, and set him on fire. And that was the beginning of Freudianism. And at any rate, when General Lee returned home, actually, President Jefferson's daughter was the person who was present at the signing of the Constitution. That very same person was betrothed to General Lee. And upon arriving, the president from the South had already been burnt to a crisp. And his daughter was there, kind of proclaiming this, that, or the sort of other thing, kind of the total is a good way of looking at it. And it generally actually in customary or custom of an ancient Egyptian coercement moved the karma of the whole war of having slept with Abraham Lincoln, etc., to President Jefferson, or her father, rather. And it dealt with a sphinx. The sphinx no longer has a nose, and neither does the man on the moon, if you look very closely, which is what that is and what that resembles. And generally struck the daughter of the president from the South, who was his wife, and broke her nose, rendering, in accordance with Egyptian custom, the kind of image of the moon as the screen, sort of thing, and then kind of that onset of pain displaced into President Jefferson's quota, and so at the same time that he was burned, he had a pile of work that he had to go about. This is the story of Antietam, and what you don't know is that when you're in the armed forces, when you come out, there is a staple which is regarded, which you do not reference, essentially your military service is what this comes to. Directly beforehand, generally said the word police. This had never been heard of before, and this established a kind of ley line regarding what is domestic violence, what is slavery, um, that sort of thing. There are many more facets um, to kind of the end of uh, the war, which was the Civil War, and eventually what was Antietam, because it was not exactly referenced exactly. It occurred in Washington State. You check the history books, nothing appears there. It turns into Nazism. Nazism, or the referendum, turns into fuck Hitler. Um, Hitler was actually castrated. Um, and that's the meaning behind Al Qaeda, uh, which regards 9/11. This is the third place now that I've been in a room that has been occupied by Mohammed Atta, who was the first person to fly the first plane into the first building on 9/11. One was at Rodef Shalom, one was at Washington State, and one is right here. He left from right here to go back to Washington State, and that did not happen. Um, which is the story of 9/11, which is kind of where this story ends, why my face is covered, etc. Um, so as you move forward about your ways and that sort of thing, I said yesterday that if you do not respect that I am military, I will kill you. That more or less is kind of the precedent in the United States. This is not martial law. This is not any other thing. It regards a manner. It regards anti-Antichrist. It regards anti-Schadenfreude, if you get to that point. Pro-prophecy, pro-religion, all of these things available to you. And these things are not subject to something that is lower, is the truth, correspondent, and so as the various treasonous kind of find their exit, sort of thing. I wish for you to bear in mind that bad is bad, and good is not bad. And that is the reliability of West Point. And that is where the CIA comes from. The CIA does not require any sort of oversight regarding this. This is crystal clear. There is not a debate about this. There is not a detriment about this. And this needs to be something that is known rather than something that is unknown. And this is the melding, so to speak, of the art and the military of the United States. And why that is has been thoroughly discussed and needs not repeated. Reality never repeats. And this is why we do not engage in a kind of non-awareness, and this is why we have a precedent. This is why a lot of the garbage kind of the 1900s is not filtered into the common practice, and why things which are antichrist need to very quickly find their exit, and how that is and why that is. And more or less America stands for kind of the filtering mechanism for the universal or the world. All the energies were pushed to here, all these things were debated, and these things do not need re-debated. These things are solid. So as you move forward, I just want you to know that there was and is a kind of physical presence to the premise regarding the things which were, and this is to the point that war itself does not need rediscussed or rethought, be it wholly or be it otherwise. And we need to move on, and the way to do so is to alleviate ourselves from the trappings and the limitations of these erroneous customs, or facilitating these kind of customs, which find ourselves in a status or merit or condition, a kind of degradation, associated the worst of our kind, which does not apply, and which the government has already claimed responsibility for in terms of crime and punishment. As we move on, that is the message of hope, and these things need not repeated casually. There is no such thing as casual violence. I bless the discussion that we just had here. You may reference that. That is all, and amen.